everyone. Welcome. This is our first religious studies speaker of the year. It's my pleasure to introduce Jack Traphagan. He's a professor emeritus of anthropology in the Human Dimensions of Organization program at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Traphagan holds a master's degree in social ethics from Yale, a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Pittsburgh, and his research interests revolve around the intersection of culture, science, and he's explored issues like the cultural construction of illness in Japan, concepts of autonomy and biomedical ethics, the relationship between culture, religion, and science, and the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence. He's published numerous articles and chapters in anthropological, medical, and religious studies journals, and is the author of several books, including Taming Oblivion, Aging Bodies and the Fear of Senility in Japan, The Practice of Concern, Ritual, Well-Being, and Teaching in Rural Japan, and Rethinking Autonomy, Critique of Principalism in Biomedical Ethics. His most recent book on space is titled Extraterrestrial Intelligence and Human Imagination, SETI at the Intersection of Science, Religion, and Culture, which was published in 2015. Dr. Traphagan is currently a fellow with ASU's Interplanetary Initiative, and is affiliated with Shippers. He's the inaugural recipient of the new fellowship collaboration between Interplanetary Initiative and Shippers. And the project that he's doing for that fellowship explores how the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency has its programs and narratives around space exploration are shaped by Japanese religious ideas. His findings will be published in a volume tentatively titled Religion and Space Exploration Cross-Cultural Perspective, part of a shared that will be developed in a symposium later this year. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Traphagan for his talk, The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, Star Trek and Cargo Cult. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I need to learn how to have shorter techniques for books. But thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with everyone here and hopefully learn from all of you and talk a little bit about some of my ideas. So I'm going to talk about extraterrestrial intelligence, or the search for it, and kind of its intersection with Star Trek and cargo cult thinking, and I'll explain what I mean by that. My aims in this presentation are to explore SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, as a cultural practice of imagination. I see it as having a kind of eschatology, an evolutionary eschatology, in which intelligent species are saved. It's sort of a kind of a philosophy of end things, where they're saved through technological and various kinds of associated progress. And this is part of a social imaginary that is tied to Star Trek, which I think has very significantly shaped the way that SETI scientists, mostly astronomers, have thought about and also justified their work. SETI is it has, along with astrobiology, it has become more mainstream than it used to be, but for a long time it was out on the edge of things. And actually, back in the 80s, Senator William Proxmire gave it his Golden Fleece Award, and funding was actually cut off for it for a long time. So I'm going to talk about how this kind of intersects with Star Trek, and how Star Trek functions as a kind of social imaginary that's wrapped up with ideas about cultural evolution. So I want to begin with a quote from Gene Roddenberry. He says, "I believe in humanity. We're an incredible species. We're still just a child creature. We're still being nasty to each other. And all children go through those phases. We're growing up. We're moving into adolescence now. When we grow up, man, we're really going to be something." This is a very typical kind of thing from Roddenberry. This theme runs through Star Trek, but it's also very typical of what we hear when we see comments by SETI astronomers about what they're doing. And it has a set of interesting assumptions in it. One assumption is that civilizations are like individual human beings, and they go through stages of maturity. Another one is that we have some way to know where we are on the growth chart right now. Another one is that Earth has only one civilization. And then the last one is that the idea that behaviors like violence will come to an end in the future. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think any of these are accurate representations of what's going on. But these ideas are floating around in what Roddenberry says, and as you'll see, they're floating around in how ideas related to cultural evolution get adopted and used within the context of SETI research. But I want to begin by going way back in time to the 19th century and talk a little bit about racist ideas about cultural evolution. In the 19th century, social scientists got interested in taking Darwin's ideas and applying them to social change. And you wound up with various kinds of typologies that expressed the process through which civilizations move. So this one here is by Lewis Henry Morgan. He was a lawyer who lived in upstate New York. He's actually considered the father of anthropology in the United States because he did the first work on kinship, which was actually the core of American anthropology for a long time. And he developed this way of thinking about how societies evolve, and they go from lower savagery, which is associated with fruit and nut subsistence, through middle savagery to upper savagery, where we get the bow and arrow, to lower barbarism, where we see the emergence of pottery, and then, upper barbarism, iron tools, and then civilization, phonetic alphabet and writing. You can read civilization as Europe and the United States in the 19th century, because that's effectively what he was saying. And one of the things that we see in this is a linkage between the concept of progress that was really powerful in the 19th century and the idea that civilizations or societies change in a directional way. It isn't just change, it's going somewhere. And that change is closely tied to technology. If you go back to this, you can see that everything that he works on as an indication of what stage you're at is technological. We don't see anything like arts there or anything like that. It's various kinds of technological innovations. So what Morgan does, and what lots of other people did during this period of time, is they basically correlate levels of technological progress with human social progress, and they often tie it to moral progress. Those things get all linked together. And so as humans, societies evolve, they get better. Now, there's an interesting problem with this. That's not at all what's happening in Darwinian evolution. There is no better in evolutionary theory. There's just change. That's it. We're not any better than any other organism, and it's just a matter of which organisms are adapted to which kinds of environments. But in the 19th century, when this got applied, particularly to social contexts, there was this very strong sense that things get better. Morgan does something else that is typical of this period of time. He normalizes the idea of progress as being a defining feature of social change for all human beings. There is really no awareness of cultural variation in the way that he puts this together. So he doesn't have a sense that there might be a society for which being advanced means being artistically developed, whereas for another one, it might be having, bombs. Now, interestingly enough, this was rejected a long time ago. This guy is Franz Boas. He founded the first anthropology department in the United States at Columbia. He was actually trained as a physicist in Germany, but he came to the US, got interested in indigenous people here, and developed the idea of field work as a way to collect empirical data. That's what he was trying to do. And one of the things that became important for him was the notion of cultural relativism. Now, I don't have time to get into the history of this concept. This is a fraught concept in anthropology. But what I want to explain is why this arose for him. He was looking at these evolutionary theories and didn't think they made sense. And instead argued, no, there are just lots of different ways that humans organize themselves. One isn't any better than any other. They're just different ways of doing things. And so a hunter-gatherer society is not less advanced than a modern industrial society. It's different. And if you think about this for a minute, it actually makes sense. while they may not be technologically advanced like a modern industrial society, take our society. We place a strong emphasis on the value of egalitarianism. Hunter-gatherer societies are the most egalitarian societies you've ever developed. So in that sense, they're considerably more advanced than modern, highly technological American society. So what Boas did was he wanted to abandon this idea of progress as a measure of cultural change and advancement and simply look at different forms of social organization and understand how they come together. Now, what's interesting is this idea of cultural evolution has played a major role in how SETI scientists and others have thought about what ET might be like out there. So this is an example. This is known as the Kardashev scale. This was proposed by a Soviet astronomer. This gets used all the time when you read SETI literature. And he described different types of civilization. Type 1 is one, and it is kind of like us. It can harness all the energy that reaches its home planet from its parent star. So we're not there yet, but we're kind of getting there. You know, we start putting solar panels in orbit, we'll be getting closer. A type 2 civilization can harness the energy radiated by its own star and all of it. So this is not just what gets to the planet, but everything. So you might have something like a Dyson sphere, where you take all of the matter in a star system and you build a huge ball around the star. And then you can harness all the energy that comes from the star. And then a type 3 would be a civilization that can control the energy on a scale of its own galaxy, not just its own star system. That's kind of a rather stunning jump when you think about it. But there are some interesting assumptions in Kardashev's approach. He's very much channeling the kind of evolutionary structure that Morgan was using in the 19th century. And this basically ties development of human civilizations or other civilizations to technological progress. So cultural evolution is either largely or only evident in technological progress. Technological progress occurs in a social value vacuum. It's seen as being largely value neutral. And so it's not really tied to things like local culture and local ideational conditions, the way people think about the world in a particular place. Advanced civilizations are those that have the technological power to manipulate their world as they see fit. They can make use of the energy that's available to them and can manipulate things. And if you think about this, why not emphasize something like art or egalitarian social organization? Why emphasize control over energy as the defining feature of advancement? Well, because it's doing the same thing Morgan was doing. It's saying development is tied to progress, which is measured in terms of technological development. And in this kind of way of thinking, growth or expansion becomes the measure of advancement, not something like sustainability. The object is to keep growing. That's what's supposed to happen. There are a lot of spurious assumptions in this. We think about cultural or moral development, technological progress. The idea that they go hand in hand is pretty dubious. I don't think you could make an easy case that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was somehow morally advanced. It's obviously one of the most horrible things humans have ever done. And so, it's very difficult to make any kind of linkage there that actually makes sense. The only example, the only data point we have that would help us understand this idea is our planet. And it doesn't work this way. Our history, involves technological advancement that also usually involves with that the ability to get much more efficient at killing people and lots of other things. The other problem is, what does advancement mean? Why measure it in terms of technology? What would advancement even mean in art or music or something like that? Can we say that, I don't know, the jazz of Thelonious Monk is more advanced than the classical music of Mozart? Well, I don't know how you even measure something like that. This idea floats around a lot in the SETI community. And this notion of it being tied to our evolutionary adolescence is a key concept. You see it in things like arguments that For example, here, comment was made that, there are long-lived alien civilizations for perhaps millions of years have advanced far beyond our current level, and they learned how to cope successfully with the technologies and the other things that could lead to their own extinction. And then you see phrases like this: imagine what we could learn from them. Well, I can imagine what we could learn from them. And if they're not peaceful, they're not very good things that we might learn from them. They might actually show up to eat our brains. If they do that, then it was a bad day for us. And so there's this optimistic kind of mindset that we see the same sort of thing in Star Trek, always cropping up when we see particularly justification for setting. Of course, the whole idea of stability is also a problem. One of the key assumptions in SETI ideology is that in order for a civilization to last for a long time, it has to stabilize. There is no evidence to support this on our planet. I don't even know exactly what we mean when we talk about a civilization, because we're really a collection of civilizations that have come and gone. And, what we think of as civilization has been around for 11,000 years, but that's, I've got periods of significant instability and occasional periods of stability. So the culture I study, Japan, had a period of 250 years of no warfare. They were basically locked off from the rest of the world, and they didn't have any war. That ended when the Americans showed up. Commodore Perry showed up in Tokyo Bay and said, trade with us or we'll blow you up. And they were like, wow, if you don't have war, you don't develop your technologies of warfare. In fact, that's what happened in Japan. They developed their arts. And so they were way behind. And so they proceeded to figure out how to develop their technology, and went very quickly from being a very peaceful society to being an empire that was one of the most belligerent the world has ever seen. So this idea that somehow it's headed towards a direction doesn't make much sense, because what we see in our own history are ups and downs with this. It does make sense for a civilization, if it's going to become interstellar, to blow itself up, if it's bound to one planet. Once it leaves the original planet, anything goes. So if we leave Earth and colonies on Mars, maybe some other places in our solar system, well, blowing up the Earth doesn't end human civilization, it just changes it. And in fact, there's also, as I'll come back to, a problem of when we do that, we may speciate anyway. So it may be actually fights between different species of human, not the same. So our society is based on consumption and expansion. Why couldn't ET society be based on consumption and expansion? Interesting thing about Earth, generally the species that we think of being the most intelligent, and that's a problematic term we think of, are predators. So they consume, and that's what we do. We just keep consuming. So often this gets thought of in terms of the idea that, well, as we go into space, we're getting more peaceful, we're working together. The International Space Station is an example of this. But if you look at technologies like the V2 rocket, the atomic bomb, it certainly doesn't seem that technology brings a reduction in our capacity for violence. And if we become a multi-world civilization or a collection of civilizations, as a political scientist Daniel Dudney has written, there are all sorts of other problems that are going to arise that we're not thinking much about. So, for example, there was a plan under the Obama administration to move an asteroid into lunar orbit so it could be studied and examined, eventually maybe mined. Well, the same technology that would move it into lunar orbit can target a city on the Earth. And the power of that makes an atomic bomb look like a fairly minor problem. So, and it's just kinetic energy, but it's an enormous amount of energy. If we think about that, as we expand into space, we've got some real dangers ahead of us that might not wipe out our civilization, but might really change it. So, skepticism is a good idea. We shouldn't be too optimistic about meeting ET or going into space. And I want to talk about how that optimism has tended to operate in the SETI world. And so I want to begin by talking about the Star Trek imaginary. And by imaginary, I mean a kind of a way to see the world, sort of a way to structure the world. And if you think about Star Trek, it tends to be divided into worlds that are either unified or not unified. And the ones that are unified are on a good track, and the ones that aren't unified are on a bad track. And so this is from an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation called First Contact, and Krola here and Marista are two aliens where Picard shows up and scares the crap out of them all because, you know, the aliens are here. And this one, he's the head of their security ministry, and she's the head minister of science. And he's terrified of the aliens. He's really xenophobic, and he tries to disrupt everything. And she's the optimistic scientist who's like, hey, this is great. The aliens are here. We're going to have a wonderful future. We're going to go into space and all that. And so these represent what is thought of in Star Trek as immature civilizations and mature civilizations. That's what the two characters are basically representing. And this theme comes up a lot in Star Trek. It's not unique to this episode, although I think it's a pretty good episode. And you see it in other places. You see it in Sagan's book Contact and the movie with that. Generally, these are based on this Western idea about civilization being tied to progress and the connection of technological progress with moral progress. Well, we see this also in SETI. This is Jill Tarter. She has been one of the real leaders of SETI for a long time. Has been, I don't know if she was the head of the SETI Institute, but anyway, she's a prominent person. And when asked what she would ask Extraterrestrial Intelligence, she said, how did you do it? How did you manage to get through the technological adolescent phase? There we go again with adolescence. That we on Earth are in today to become an old, sustained technological civilization. Well, again, I don't know how we know we're in adolescent phase, and I don't know what that means anyway. And this is basically the same argument that we're getting from Morgan 100 plus years earlier, that it's technology that defines progress, and that progress is even the thing we need to think about. There are other examples of this. Lamar Shannon Lomberg. Lomberg was one of the people involved with designing the plaque that was on the Pioneer spacecraft. He's an artist. He said, they said all civilizations should evolve ethically at the same time as they evolve technologically. I don't know why they should do that, but they should. When these civilizations reach their technological adolescent stage, they must perform an ethical societal mutation or become extinct. After learning how to reach a synergetic harmony among the individual members, their groups, and their habitat, they would extend this practice to all living beings, including their hypothetical galactic neighbors. Now, that certainly falls into the realm of speculation. And I actually don't see any reason why any of those things would happen. But this narrative is really key in SETI. If you think about it, SETI's never found anything. We have no evidence that there's anybody else out there. And they've been at this since like 1961. So they have to justify their existence. Well, one way to justify it is to say, we will get these great things because ET is going to be way better than us, going to be way smarter than us. So there's a kind of hope that goes on for cultural and existential salvation. ET will save us from ourselves. They'll bring guidance, bring technology. Contact will end political divisions, will unify humanity. This is actually something you hear quite often. The thing we need to unify humanity is for ET to show up because we'll all come together around the fear of this alien that shows up. I honestly don't think that's true. I'll come back to that. Maybe there's a galactic federation and we can join that. I kid you not, that was on the SETI Institute's website at one point when I looked, and I was like, really? This is tied to this need to justify what SETI does with optimistic assessments about what the benefits, what the outcome of contact might be for us. If you do think about it, it would be very difficult to support SETI, again, if the outcome was likely to be that ET will show up and eat us. That's not going to go very well. Again, the evidence isn't very good. The only data point we have on Earth, contact among humans, groups, almost always goes badly for the less technologically developed group. It's something routinely seen throughout history. There's also little evidence to support the idea that we are any less violent than we have been in the past. Now, I say that, I often give talks like this to groups of engineers, and I always get the, what about Pinker question? Well, Pinker is dumb about this topic, I'm sorry to say. His argument has, he wrote a book that basically says we're far less violent than we were hundreds, thousands of years ago, and violence is kind of going away. He did all kinds of things wrong. It's really bad social science. He cherry-picked the data. He downplays violence that doesn't really fit his narrative very well. It's really ethnocentric. How do you define violence? What does that mean? It doesn't mean the same thing in every culture. The data for violence, like, how much data do we have on domestic abuse from 500 years ago? Well, we don't have any, because they didn't keep data like that. He ignores things like the normalization of violence through various kinds of institutionalized forms of violence. And then if you just think about the 20th century, I don't know how you could argue it's less violent than our past with 60 million dead in World War II. That's like a bizarre argument. And I don't think the 21st century is looking a whole lot better. And then if you just think about it, if we have one moment of total nuclear war, we will have done a level of violence that makes everything we've done in our history look like nothing good altogether. And so his argument makes no sense at all. But technotypes like this dude, they love this argument because there's this idea that technology is bringing us to a better world, a less violent world, even though the evidence doesn't support that. And of course, the notion of progress is always a flawed notion, no matter what you do. Progress for whom? Has our technological development been a positive thing? Has it been progress for all the other animals on our planet? I don't think so. If we look at things like prison populations in the United States, well, is that progress? Depends on how you define it. And if you think about the number of people in prison and the violence that goes on in prisons, again, it's very difficult to see that we've been making headway in reducing violence. So what I want to do now is turn to this issue of cargo cults that I was talking about at the beginning. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this. Cargo cults arose and have arisen, particularly in Melanesia, as a result of contact with outside groups, particularly with colonial powers. They typically involve some kind of synthesis of foreign and indigenous cultural ideas, the charismatic leaders involved, and usually requests for help, often from one group's ancestors. And generally, they believe that goods or cargo will appear in abundance that happen through the ritual associations and activities that are done by the cult. So one of the things they will do is they will build things that look like technology that they're seeing, even though they're just images of technology. They don't, that obviously is not a flying aircraft. It's wood and straw. Generally, these seem to be responses to changing social environments, and they also often function as a critique of the status quo, typically of what is seen as progress by colonial powers, by people who've been left behind, ignored, crushed, or exploited. Those are the people among whom these typical organizations, and I should say by cult, I don't mean this in the negative sense that it's typically used kind of in the media. By cult, what I mean is a group of non-institutionalized sort of religious structure or ritual structure that's loosely organized. So it's not like that the kind of typical negative meaning of cult that you see most of the time. So cargo cults have been widely discussed in post-World War II anthropological literature, particularly related to colonialism in Melanesia. Usually they involve building these structures that have the form, but not the content, not the technology, the thing that they're looking like. And in 1964, a very interesting one of these emerged, known as the Johnson cargo cult. And it was an attempt to get Johnson as their leader. What I'm going to argue in the rest of my talk here is that SETI looks a lot like the Johnson cartoon. So this cult in the 1960s in New Hanover and Papua New Guinea, group of people raised $1,000 because they wanted to send it to President Johnson in hopes that he might come and be their leader. Now, I don't think they ever really believed that he was going to come and be their leader. But thousands of people refused to follow the things that the Australian colonial government wanted, like participation in standard balloting practices. They wanted to vote for LBJ. That's what they were saying. And they thought this might be good because they had had positive contacts with American military personnel who tended to share food and other goods and tended to pay well, work. There wasn't really an appeal to the supernatural here, but what they kind of thought was that addressing the idea of getting Johnson to come would be sort of getting a superhuman outsider to come and help resolve their problems as their leader in dealing again with the colonial powers. Again, it's unlikely most Hanoverians really believed that Johnson would become their leader. I don't think that they thought he was superhuman either. It's more likely what was going on was that this was a form of cultural critique. They were trying to construct a belief system to create a sense of hope that they could do something about the domination that was coming from the Australian colonial government. So the cult provided a framework through which they could express their dissatisfaction with the people that were dominating them without coming right out and saying we're dissatisfied and risking. There were some moments of violence when people did come out and openly protest what was going on. And so they were basically trying to generate a counter paradigm to the colonial paradigm that was going on. So what does this have to do with SETI? Well, one reasonable interpretation of the Johnson cult is that, like a lot of millennial movements, it was a belief in action system to help marginalized and disempowered people deal with their colonial oppressors. It was a form of cultural critique. Now, think about the SETI narrative. ET's more advanced than we are. They will bring knowledge that will save us. Our world sucks. Well, you've got the same pattern going on. You've got basically dissatisfied SETI scientists appealing to the acquisition of cargo in the form of knowledge and help from ET, this powerful imagined outsider. We don't even know if ET exists, so it's imagined at this point. And that in some way will solve the problems that these scientists see in the world around them, that they feel somewhat marginalized from because their scientific perspective isn't being used to solve those problems. So empowered extraterrestrials, they're kind of like superhumans, super beings. They have advanced technologies, advanced moral abilities, and that would allow them to solve our problems and basically deal with disempowered people, make our world a better place. And you see various kinds of justification of SETI that reflect this kind of cargo cult thinking. One of the things that you see very often in the SETI community is an argument that the value of SETI is that it somehow places humanity in cosmic perspective, and it shows us that we're all the same. And in doing that, it trivializes the fact that we're actually not all the same, that there are very significant and important cultural differences among different groups. And it downplays that in favor of this narrative that, well, we're all the same. If we just realize that, we'd be all great. Now, does any of this matter? Who cares about SETI? Well, it matters. You probably aren't even aware of the fact that there are people sending messages targeted at star systems where we think there are potentially habitable planets with messages from Earth right now. That's been going on for a long time, and it's intensifying because access to radio telescopes is becoming easier. There are two different kinds of SETI. There's active SETI, sending of messages, and passive SETI, just listening. In general, SETI scientists have viewed passive SETI as being unproblematic. What harm could come from listening for ET? Active SETI has been a big ethical debate in the SETI community because there are quite a few people who don't think it's a good idea. You know, if you think about it, we don't know anything about what ET might be like. And we don't know if we live in like a really nasty neighborhood or something. So it might turn out that ET is mean. And we send up a nice big signal saying, hi, we're here. And they show up on our doorstep and vaporize our planet for fun. We have no idea what the consequences are. So there's a potential existential threat. It might be small, but it's there from sending messages. A lot of time to deal with these questions, SETI scientists draw into Star Trek imaginary. Then they think about risk. They think that advanced aliens will be peaceful, so and altruistic, so there won't be a risk. They'll bring this cargo that will save us. At the very minimal, even if this isn't a problem, that imaginary biases the way that SETI scientists go about their research, because they think what they're looking for, they're pre-imagining what they're looking for, and that biases the way they go about things. Now, I talked about passive SETI and active SETI. Active SETI seems like it's risky because you're sending out messages. My colleague, retired U.S. Air Force General Ken Wieshan, and I published a paper in 2020 that actually led to a fair amount of discussion. And we argued that passive SETI is actually risky, that if you look at it from a realpolitik perspective, if, let's say the US gets a message tomorrow, one of our radio telescopes picks it up. We're not communicating too well with the Russians right now. The Russians don't know what's in that message, but they know we got something. Well, immediately they're going to start thinking there's a gap in knowledge there, and they're going to think about how do we address that gap. So it's going to be in the interests of a society to either monopolize the contact scenario or maybe generate conflict when it appears that it's being monopolized by someone else. Just to put this in more concrete terms, imagine this. You know, the Russians are fighting this war in Ukraine right now. We get a message. Communication between different radio telescopes isn't very good. And they think we got a message that has a lot of information in it. They don't know what the message is. So they start pushing. Maybe they decide they need to threaten to use tactical nukes in Ukraine to find out what's in that message. And maybe they do it. Well, if that happens, we have no idea where things are going. And if you think that sounds far-fetched, think about how World War I started. An unimportant archduke got assassinated, and it led to, up to that point in time, the worst war in human history. So it doesn't take much. And so we really need to think about that. So a rebuttal was published by an astronomer named Jason Wright and some of his colleagues from Penn State. And he thought we were being too cynical. He said, scientists will cooperate and they will exchange information. Well, that might be true. That doesn't mean governments will cooperate. He thought that this will prevent governments from trying to monopolize the contact scenario, and monopoly over information contained in a message isn't really possible in any case because scientists will be talking to each other. That's actually not true. They might talk to each other, but it's possible to shut things down. So, and he thinks transparency and data sharing will prevent conflict. I think this is a very rosy picture of what's likely to happen, because usually things don't go this way with humans. Even if scientists are cooperating, it doesn't mean governments will do it. So as far as I'm concerned, right is wrong. The thing that really matters here isn't sharing data, it's perception. If governments think that control over the contact scenario is in their interest, they will pursue control over the scenario. Competition over that could lead from anything from diplomatic tensions to World War III. One of the things we talked about in our article was the possibility of cyber attacks against radio telescopes to shut down communication. 3 weeks ago, a report came out that there have been cyber attacks against radio telescopes. It was almost exactly what we described, not over ET, but for other reasons. So a lot of this just depends on what the context in which contact happens is. I think Wright and his colleagues are influenced by the Star Trek imaginary. They have a hard time imagining the idea that this contact scenario could be really bad for human beings. I don't know if it is or not, but I think we have to imagine that it could be. What I will say, it's important to have this debate. I think, although I don't agree with Wright, I think what he said, what his group said is important because it gets this out into the public. This argument has largely been confined to the world of SETI scientists and a few other social scientists and philosophers, and this pushed it into the public discourse. And so I think that's really important because it's a way to push it past the Star Trek imaginary and really begin to think about what the implications of contact with extraterrestrials are. This needs to happen now before we have contact. Contact can happen anytime, and rose-colored glasses are a really bad way to approach this. So to just give you an idea, these are some of the articles that were written up on the debate that we had going on. Daily Beast, Newsweek, Supercluster, Vice, there are a whole bunch of places that published articles on this because, of course, it captures people's attention. They're interested in UFOs and ETs and stuff like that. But I think I was actually very glad that even though I don't agree with what Wright said, I was glad they wrote the paper because it generated this interest and got it beyond just scientists talking about it. So that's what I have to say, and I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes.
So what should we do? Should we just assume that whatever's out there is out there and we shouldn't be pursuing it?
You should assume they're dangerous. It's better to assume they're dangerous and find out that they're not than to assume they're nice and sweet, find out they're not. So my opinion is we should be working from the assumption that we really need to think deeply about the risks, particularly with active SETI. I think the risks are there with passive SETI, but they're from us. They're our risks. They're what we do with the context. Getting a message isn't a problem. It's how we react to it. We do need to think about that. And with active SETI, we need to be thinking about, should we, for example, who speaks for Earth? Who gets to put the message together? And the people who have been putting the message together are basically white male astronomers. And that doesn't really speak for Earth. So I think we have to have a really broad public discourse on this before it happens. Now, it may never happen, but we're getting to the point now where because we know there are lots and lots of other planets and other star systems, it's becoming more reasonable to think there might be other civilizations. Yes.
I say do you believe, I think I'm very much resonating with your kind of caution around this, but I'm wondering, is there a danger to being too pessimistic about ETs? I think of for every ET, there's also the thing. We imagine that these species might be just ultimately malicious. Is there for me at least, I think, is there a kind of danger or a kind of reinterpretation of the Star Trek Imagine in the way we're just too far backwards, so we should be annihilated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some people think that way. My opinion is that there's really no should involved with this. It's the should is related to how we should be thinking about risk. And in a context where we don't know what the risk is, we should make assumptions on the pessimistic side to be careful. And again, the risks are anywhere from ET showing up and solving all our problems to, have you seen the episode of Twilight Zone called The Served Man? Well, that's another option. If you haven't seen it, go look at it. But things could go really bad for us. And if they are vastly superior to us technologically, which they will be if they show up here. So this is one of the problems with this whole UFO thing. think about how stupid the idea is. You're telling me ET has the technology to travel light years to come to Earth, but doesn't have stealth technology. Really? Does that make any sense at all? It doesn't make any sense. The idea that UFOs have come here is not impossible, but it really doesn't make much sense if you really start thinking about what kind of technological being would have to come here. They would be vastly, vastly beyond us. So they wouldn't be accidentally showing up on our radar all the time. They would know how to deal with that. And so it just doesn't work very well. But if they're that far beyond us, they also can probably just vaporize our planet. This isn't a fight we can win if it's a fight situation. That's what it comes down to. What else?
But it's also a fight that we may never have.
We may well never have it.
If they know about us, and in all these centuries, they've left us alone, so, or we think they have.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing too is that, I mean, our current understanding of the laws of physics mean they can't get here really. I mean, you could get here in a generation starship that, you know, was traveling for eons. Why would they do that? And, you know, and so unless they know something about physics that we don't know, which is certainly possible, they really can't get here. And if they do know something about physics that we don't know, we're no threat to them. And so you kind of put all the pieces together, and it's really hard to imagine. I could imagine them as an anthropologist. I could kind of imagine them coming here to study us, to look at how, you know, civilizations where we are operate. They might, you know, if they're nasty, they might just come to step on us like you can step on an anthill too. It's hard to know. What else? I thought of something. Yes,
What do
Matt.
you recommend for SETI as a program? Do you recommend it just disappear or
Stop the hyperbole. I think it's a useful program, but they need to stop with the grand statements about the benefits of their program. It's an interesting thing. I don't think I have ever been to a SETI conference where somebody didn't say, finding out that there's life elsewhere, not even intelligent, just life elsewhere, will change humanity forever. That's just not true. And I know it's not true because we've already been through this. In the late 19th century, Percival Lowell was writing articles convincing people that Mars had civilization way beyond ours because they built vast canals that moved water across the surface of the planet. And people believed that. And it didn't change anything.
isn't this an intrinsic problem in a lot of these programs that are dependent on government funding or external funding to continue to
Got to sell it.
exist? Is you've got to have great salespeople. Every year they got to go sell to find the money to keep it going.
That is part of the problem. So one solution would be, if we're going to do this, let's find a way to fund it without having to sell it like that. And, you know, the SETI Institute has tried to do that. They tried to build the Allen telescope array. They were going to build, I think, 300 small radio telescopes. They built like 50 because they ran out of money. So, you know, there is a problem with just getting people to fund this kind of thing. Unfortunately, the hyperbole sells. And that creates an image for people that there's stuff going on here that really isn't going on. And it creates a very warped image of what SETI is about, or what it could be about, and what contact it could be about. You had another question.
What about the archaeological findings in Greece and Egypt that, you know, there was no known human technology that would have allowed for, and all that kind of thing?
All bunk. All of that is, well, there's several things going on with that. A lot of times when people claim there was no known technology, well, sometimes we don't know about technology our ancestors developed. That's true. It goes away. The archaeological record isn't perfect. A lot of times people have said things like, we don't know how they built the pyramid. You know exactly how they built it. Slaves. Not slaves, you can build pyramids. That's how we built the pyramids. There's an interesting thing with the whole ancient aliens thing. Many people don't notice. It's super racist. It's only brown people the aliens help. They didn't help the Romans. I wonder why. It is a really fun thing to look at, but there is zero evidence that aliens have ever visited our planet. There's no material evidence for that, and the ancient alien stuff simply doesn't work. The other thing it does is it downplays and disregards the creative potential of other peoples. So go take a look at a Picasso portrait and ask, is that an alien? Maybe aliens, it's a picture of an alien who came here. We never do that because he's Western. But go look at some abstract art form done by Mayans. Well, they don't have abstracts because they're not developed like we are. Must be aliens. That's what's going on. So it's not so important. It's a great question. Thank you. I'm glad you brought it up.
So first of all, Professor Traphagan, it's a great talk.
Thank you.
Appreciate you sharing sort of systematic thinking for SETI, also drawing on religious studies concepts. So this is a question sort of about two things that intersect. So I've sat there listening and thinking about Cixin Liu's History of the Earth's Remembrance of the Earth's Past, this trilogy.
Yeah.
Dark Forest. Trilogy. Many of these same concepts are in there. So one of the questions I have is clearly the audience is interested in, like, well, what should we do? And I wonder what you would say about the relationship between SETI in public and private, right? Like, if we start having a fulsome public conversation about regulation, international standards, and we now live in a moment where the technological capacity and financial resources to bring active SETI technologies to scale is in the hands of 3 or 4 individual men that we've named them, and they're also all super fascinated by Star Trek and science fiction, space travel, and so this question is sort of like, what do you think about this sort of questions of the privatization of SETI, the potential for public oversight? Like, what do you have to say about that sort of landscape?
It's a minefield. Let me start with one thing that I think that needs to happen. With active SETI, I think all active SETI research projects should go through an institutional review board. And the reason for that is because anytime we do research that involves human subjects or non-human animals, it has to be vetted by an institutional review board that looks at the ethics of the research that's being done. If you're sending messages out into space, and they call these experiments when they do it, then you're experimenting on potential aliens, sentient beings. So it needs to go through an ethics process. So that's one thing I think that needs to start happening. I don't really believe, because the distances are so enormous, I don't think there's an enormous existential threat for humans just having contact. I do think there's a big threat of what we might do to each other. That's a different issue. What I do think we need to do is we actually have to have government starting to get involved in developing protocols for first contact. We have protocols, but they were created by astronomers who basically, and they aren't adopted by anywhere. So, it isn't like the UN uses them or anything. So they're not very meaningful. And it's totally voluntary if any scientist follows those protocols that they come across the message. So I think we need to have serious discussions at a governmental level and an international level about how we're going to deal with this. The other thing I think we have to do is we should stop sending any kind of signal until we started having a real discussion about how we construct the message. And what you say on behalf of 8 billion humans, we haven't had that conversation even remotely. And so I think basically active SETI should be outlawed. Now, this is where the problem that comes with privatization. I don't know how the fact of the matter is it's pretty hard to control what gets sent. And there's lots of other stuff that we've sent. I mean, does everyone know, if ET's out there, the first thing that will get to aliens. Do you know what it is? The radio signal.
It's the earliest radio.
Hmm?
It's the earliest radio broadcast.
Actually, the earliest television broadcast. And who's on that broadcast? That's who's on the broadcast. Our emissary to the universe is Adolf. That's the first thing that will be picked up. Now, they won't know what he was saying. So in that sense, it doesn't really matter. So, but, you know, stuff's out there, but not direct stuff. That's different from picking a target and sending a message and saying, we want to communicate with you. We need to control that in some way and get it not to happen until we figured out how it should happen. That's really what I think we have to do. I'm not really against doing it, but not now.
There's a sort of parallel conversation in the climate engineering or geoengineering space. There's this looming problem. There are technologies that can potentially solve it, and those technologies have all sorts of implied risk. And there's a slowly developing process in the international community to regulate that. But there's essentially the same problem you have with the non-proliferation and treaty testing. Like an individual nation imperiled by climate change can be like, I'm not going to sign that treaty. We're going to start putting solar aerosols in the atmosphere to protect ourselves. And you sort of have this rogue active issue. Certainly have here, right?
And even,
We
yeah,
can't regulate what parts ever does climate change.
we can. And even regulating where there is a treaty, like there's a treaty on how we should use the moon. It's not going to stop anybody from doing what they want to do with it, particularly private enterprise. And so, so technically, we can't go to the moon, plant our flag, and claim the moon for the United States. No country that's a signature to the treaty on the use of the moon can do that. I don't know if China signed that. So they can do whatever they want. I'm not sure. I don't know. But you know, a country that hasn't signed it can do what they want. And frankly, we all know the U.S. has never broken a treaty. So it isn't, you know, it isn't very meaningful. And I think that's what we have to have a meaningful discussion about this. It's not just about ET. We're actually at the cusp of what we thought we were going to be at in the 1960s a lot earlier. We really are now moving beyond low Earth orbit, and we're going to populate low Earth orbit. We're not thinking very well about what that means for humans. You know, think about it this way. If humans go live on Mars and they start giving birth, Mars has a much lower gravitational field than Earth does. What will that mean for the beings that develop on Mars? They might never be able to come back to Earth. Their hearts would stop from the gravity. So they're going to turn into a different species. And what will that mean for the future of conflict in just our solar system? If we've got two different human species vying for the resources that we will be vying for, that's for sure. And so those kinds of questions, you see that in science fiction. Science fiction's done a really nice job thinking about these things. Yeah, but we're not seeing it in the public discourse about, you know, look, this is actually happening now. We need to start talking.
Yeah, the Space Force.
We do have that. Yeah, yeah. I'm not really a, you know, big military type. I actually think it's a good idea. I think again, the risks of not having it are very high. And I'm convinced that we will take war into space. So we need to be prepared. I just don't see any reason to think we won't do that. Again, the forces involved with what can be done in space are vastly beyond our atomic arsenals. And somebody's going to be tempted at some point. So we need to be prepared for that. And then, of course, all the cyber things. So, like you were going to say.
So the books that you've written, what would you recommend? And you know, if we were to read one of your books,
Don't read the one he mentioned. It costs $100. Stupid price. There's one I did called something like Culture, Science, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Life. That would be the one I would recommend. It's like and published by Springer in 2016 something. But, you can look me up on Amazon. Thank you. Yeah.
So even in Star Trek, you got very negative, possibilities. It's true that, the Star Trek universe is very positive. After the death of Roddenberry, though, you do get some interesting transformations. Just because, the optimistic view is so boring, right? It's Deep Space Nine. I think, especially it's especially dark. And of course, after 2000. After the 9/11, in Discovery, right? Was it not Discovery? Enterprise, right? Enterprise. There's a very interesting, terrorist attack on Earth that sort of so. Why doesn't that? Is it just the need to kind of mobilize support for these embattled, everybody's trying to, we in religious studies are always saying, yes, religion is very important for X, Y, and Z reasons because of whether, because we need to justify our existence, right? Is that the reason? Is that, would you say that's the primary thing? Or why isn't, like, there, as you say, there's a lot of really negative imagines futures in science fiction that could affect this discourse and clearly sort of you're drawing on. So
I'll throw a hypothesis out. I don't know the answer, but I think there are a few reasons. But one thing I think might be going on is a lot of the people that have been at the forefront of study are my generation, who grew up in the 60s or even a little earlier. They grew up with Star Trek. Star Trek encouraged a lot of people to become engineers. Partly because it painted such an optimistic picture of the future. I love Star Trek. I hope that's our future. I really do. I think that people sort of carried that with them into the SETI world. They were excited about finding ET because they were into Star Trek and that kind of thing. And what has happened is that has shaped the way they've gone about doing what they do. This is what I mean by, I think it biases the way they do their science. Which is a real problem, just from a scientific perspective, forget about the politics of it. But I think it has something to do with the generation that has tended to believe this, and they were very shaped by Star Trek and Apollo. The two things were intertwined, right? This is our future, and we're on our way. We're going to the moon, and great things are going to happen. We're going to have big donut-shaped space station and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think they're aware of the extent to which that's floating around in the way that they approach it. And I think it's because they grew up with it. So I think that's a big part of it. I do think younger people involved in SETI are changing. You're seeing debates in SETI about some of these things happening now. You're also seeing the emergence of people coming from other fields like me saying, well, you need to do the social science related to this. You need to understand what's going on in this from a cultural perspective. And I think that's beginning. The fact that, for example, Jason engaged us in all is important. He looked at it, and his article wasn't just, oh, these people are idiots. He made a case. The case isn't a very good case, but some of the points he made were good. And then we responded to that. But the fact that the dialogue is beginning to happen, I think, is actually a positive step, because I think there's an awareness that we need to think about the social consequences of looking for life elsewhere. We can't just assume this is going to be great, it's going to change humanity. We need to think about all of it. So that's my hypothesis.
What are your thoughts on the movie Contact? Carl Sagan's look at our response to an alien transmission.
So,
and I only mention that because, like, you talked about how, what if the U.S. receives a signal and then, well, the Russians, they obviously don't have a SETI program. However, we have very close ties with ESA. The Europeans would definitely be in on our, and likely even possibly the Australians, given the Deep Space Network, perhaps.
and might be too, yeah.
Certainly. So,
yeah.
should we receive a message, the word would get out, and assuming that message repeats.
Word would get out, but the message would not.
And that's what I guess I'm getting is that, do you really think that only one country would actually have that message?
No, I don't think it matters. What matters is how, for example, Russia perceives it. It does not matter whether we're the only ones that have the message. If the Europeans and we have it, and the Japanese have it, let's say if it's just the sort of NATO plus Japan bloc that has this. All it will take is one country, it could be the Chinese, the Russians, whoever, to see it as a threat. It doesn't matter if it is a threat. This was the point that Wright caught me. It doesn't matter if it's a threat. It doesn't matter what's in the message. The message could be empty. But if there's the perception, they've got something we don't have, might make them stronger, then we're going to see things like potentially cyber attacks against astronomical observatories and this kind of thing, because they're going to try to control it. And that's what human societies do. So I think going back to the contact question, what do I think of that? I think it's a great story, but I think it's really silly to think that astronomers would be leading after contact. How do they know about contact with other people, let alone humans? No, anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, those are the people, diplomats. This is something that's often misunderstood. SETI, the astronomers doing SETI, it's a technical thing, how to find the message. Once the message is found, it's diplomacy, it's interpretation. It becomes an issue in the humanities and social sciences. So the idea that once that happens, the astronomers are somehow still going to be vying over who leads this doesn't make sense.
So would you say the arrival would be a closer approximation?
Yes, I think it's a much better look at this, where the first thing you got to do is you got to bring in linguists. You got to bring in people who understand how communication works to unravel whatever is there to be unraveled. And so yes, arrival is much better investigation of what might occur in that kind of contact scenario. I thought that was very well done.
Just in terms of the technical aspects of reading another civilization, one theory at least is that because of the vast distances and the limitations on travel, you can't travel beyond the speed of light, as far as we know, then most likely what we would see is not aliens themselves, but rather their machines that might. So it would be the kind of contact that we have would be wouldn't be our talking to an intelligent race somewhere else. And so how does that affect your analysis in any way? Or
well, I think it's a very important thing to think about. Some people have been writing about this. The former chief of historian for NASA, Stephen Dick, wrote an article about post-biological universe. And one of the points that he raises is that if evolution continues the way it's happening here, those very advanced beings may not be biological, which means they might not even really recognize us as intelligent. That's possible. But communicating with them could be very difficult because of that. And I think you're right that given the distances, if something shows up here, it's very likely to be robotic. And so then the question is, how do we communicate with the robot? So one of the things that this sort of the Star Trek imaginary does is it screws up our thinking about what contact actually means. If we get a message from ET 100 light years away from us, which is very close, that message was sent 100 years ago. So for us to figure out what's in the message and send something back, more than 200 years will have transpired. Their civilization could be gone at that time. Think about it. If we send out a message and they pick it up 100 years from now, we may have vaporized ourselves by things like that. So this isn't communication like we normally think about. And this issue of robotics is another example of this. It's not, hi, how are you doing? It's, hi, let's wait for a century. Then we can talk about how you're doing. There's no exchange happening in this. It's whatever is chosen to be sent at the moment that something's sent out. And so we aren't going to have a conversation with ET unless they're like right next door at Alice Tori, in which case it's still gonna take 4 years, you know, to send the message that, you know, for them to get a message from us, another 4 years for them to come back. It's still 8 years round trip from our nearest star. The distances are just astonishing. People don't really think about that because Star Trek and other science fiction creates this kind of feeling that, yeah, we're just gonna bop around the galaxy like we, you know, go around Phoenix. Well, it's really not gonna be like that. Because the distances are just so enormous. So, thank you. That's a very important point.
I was thinking about Andreas Eschbach. I don't know if he wrote this. He's a German science fiction writer who wrote a very interesting novel about 10 years ago called The Lord of All Things, where it's very dystopian in that he imagines these, you know, but it combines a couple of different things, but it, you know, the ultimate, not to spoil it for anybody who might read it, but it's human civilizations on Earth actually destroy all extraterrestrial life using nanobots, right? So this is you know, quite a kind of negative negative in a variety of ways view of the possibilities of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
Oh, there are so many negatives that people don't think much about. Like, so ET sends us a message. How do we know there isn't a virus encoded in the message that might destroy our internet infrastructure? Maybe they do it just for fun because they think it's funny to watch these people, you know, 3 light years, 10 light years away, whatever, have their society collapse. Maybe they do it as an experiment. Maybe we're a threat. But that would be a very easy way to disable our world, is just, you know, if you could figure out how to access our computer technologies, you know, for example, an artificially intelligent computer virus go, it'd be toast very quickly. And so it's just like, there are a lot of dangers with this. And again, the problem is they aren't being discussed in the public discourse. I don't think that we have to come away concluding it's too dangerous to do this. We've got to have the conversation.
Very good for the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So, if you're not allowed to leave the room without taking some food or some coffee, go ahead and snack up.